On the evening of April 7th, 1990, 25-year-old Nancy Langert looked at the cardboard boxes stacked up in the living room of her home in Winnetka, Illinois, trying to figure out what else she still had to pack. She and her husband Richard were moving at the end of the month, and Nancy could not wait. She was almost 3 months pregnant, and the new house had a lot more space, including a room for the baby's nursery. But as Nancy scanned the room, she realized there really wasn't much left for her to do. Other than the boxes, the only things in the room were a TV, a stereo, a card table, and some folding chairs. The truth was that even though she and Richard had been staying in this small townhouse for months that was owned actually by her parents, they had never actually really settled in. It always felt like it was a temporary place to sort their finances out, after Richard had racked up some serious gambling debt. As soon as the thought of Richard's gambling crossed her mind, Nancy shook her head and then called for her little dog, Pepsi. She heard his nails clicking across the floor, and she picked him up and scratched under his chin, trying to take her mind off of Richard's gambling and their money issues. But it was no use. It was all she could think about. Both Nancy and Richard had good jobs working at a growing coffee company, but Richard had always liked to bet on sports. And at some point, he had started spending more than he earned and began also borrowing money from friends to keep up with his gambling. It had all come to a head months earlier when Nancy and Richard fell behind on bills and had to move into this townhouse owned by Nancy's parents. And then Nancy's mother had to create a budget for them and put them on a weekly allowance, which was very embarrassing for both of them. But recently, things had gotten a lot better. They'd paid down their debt, built up their savings again, and now they were about to move out of this temporary home. In fact, at this very moment, Nancy even had $500 in cash in her purse to deposit into her bank account. Nancy gave Pepsi a kiss and put him down on the floor, and she reminded herself to stay positive. Richard was trying hard to curb his spending, and other than his gambling issue, he really was a great husband. And Richard and Nancy had both wanted a baby for so long, and now it was finally happening, and she knew Richard was going to be an amazing father. Feeling better, Nancy sat down on a folding chair and flipped on the TV. At around 6:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was Richard, telling Nancy he was leaving work and he'd be home to pick her up in just a few minutes. They were celebrating Nancy's father's 60th birthday that night. They had an 8 p.m. dinner reservation, but they were picking up Nancy's parents and sister at her sister's place first. Nancy turned off the TV, picked up Pepsi, and took him upstairs to the bedroom so he wouldn't chew up any of the cardboard boxes while they were gone. After putting him inside, she shut the door gently, walked back downstairs, threw on a coat, and walked outside to Richard's car, shivering in the early spring chill. A few minutes later, Nancy's sister, Jean, opened the door to her apartment with a huge smile on her face. She led Nancy and Richard inside, and then she handed Nancy 2 beautifully wrapped presents that she'd brought back from a recent trip to Ireland. Nancy opened up the first gift and found a gorgeous Irish wool sweater inside. But the other present made Nancy feel like she might cry from happiness. It was a little onesie and booties for a newborn baby. Nancy thanked Jean repeatedly and gave her a big hug. She was so happy. At around 8 p.m., the group got to the restaurant, and Nancy was happily surprised to see that none of her parents' friends were meeting them there. The celebration would now just be with family. It wasn't that Nancy didn't like her parents' friends, though. Some of them had been around for so long that they actually felt like her own family. Like her dad's work friend, Nick Biro, and his wife Joan, who she had totally expected to be there. But then there was this guy, Victor, who was one of her father's closest friends, but he was also rumored to be in the mob. Nancy didn't mind Victor, but Richard could not stand him. So his absence from the party was a relief. As the food started to arrive to their table, Nancy suddenly didn't feel well. Her pregnancy was giving her really bad nausea, and the smell of pasta and steak just set it off. But she didn't want to ruin the night for everyone, so she tried to hide the fact that she really just wanted to go throw up. However, she could see her mom looking over at her with a raised eyebrow from across the table, and Nancy forced a smile back. She knew she was not convincing her mother that she was doing okay, but her mother just went back to her lasagna without saying anything, in fear she might embarrass her daughter. After dinner, Nancy and the rest of her family all piled back into Richard's car so he could drive everybody home. He dropped Nancy's sister Jean off first, and when she got out, Jean gave Nancy a big hug and told her she would see her tomorrow at church. Then Richard dropped off Nancy's parents. However, Nancy's mother paused before getting out of the car. She said she noticed at dinner that Nancy was feeling sick and asked if maybe Nancy and Richard wanted to spend the night there, at her house. For a second, Nancy did consider it. I mean, having your parents around if you're feeling sick is kind of like what everybody wants. But Richard was supposed to dog sit for a neighbor, and she wanted to sleep in her own bed, cuddled up with Pepsi, so she ultimately said, no thank you. Her parents then said goodnight, and then they walked into their house. On the drive back home, Richard and Nancy planned out the rest of their evening. Richard would walk the neighbor's dog, and then actually sleep over at the neighbor's house to keep the dog company. But first, Nancy and Richard would take their dog, Pepsi, for a walk together. They pulled up to their townhouse, and Richard walked around the car, opened up Nancy's door, and helped her outside. They smiled at each other, and he asked her how she was feeling, and Nancy said she still felt nauseous, but she was too happy about everything to let it bother her. Richard gave Nancy's shoulder a quick squeeze, and then they walked inside together. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Nancy's mother called her daughter to see if she was feeling any better. But Nancy didn't pick up, so her mom figured she must be sleeping in and hung up without leaving a message. She knew she would just see her daughter later at church anyway. However, when Nancy's mother got to church that day and took her seat in their regular pew, the bench beside her stayed empty for the entire service. Nancy's mom worried the entire time, so as soon as she got back home, she called her daughter again. And when Nancy still didn't answer, Nancy's father said he was going over to the townhouse to make sure everything was okay. Nancy's dad got to the townhouse just a few minutes later. He figured Nancy was just sick and sleeping, so he wasn't actually all that worried. He rang the bell, but nobody answered, so he took out his own key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The place felt oddly quiet, and no one responded when he called out. Then Nancy's dad saw his daughter's purse lying on the floor, surrounded by cash and credit cards, and so now he was worried. Suddenly, he heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like scratching on a door. So he ran out of the room, took the steps up 2 at a time, and then headed down the second-floor hallway to Nancy's bedroom, where the scratching sound was coming from. There, he opened up the door, and the little dog Pepsi came running out, and the stench of urine immediately hit Nancy's dad. Now he was really starting to panic. He knew his daughter would never lock her precious dog in a room long enough for the dog to have to urinate all over the ground. He turned and ran back downstairs, now screaming his daughter's name, but still he didn't get an answer. He knew there was only one place he hadn't checked yet, the basement. Nancy's father ran to the top of the basement stairs. The basement light was on, but all he could see when he looked downstairs were shadowy shapes below, which he assumed must be their moving boxes. But as he slowly walked down the stairs and the shapes came into view, he gasped. They weren't boxes. They were the bodies of his pregnant daughter and his son-in-law. They were both covered in blood. Nancy was still wearing her clothes from the night before, and her eyes were wide open. For a moment, Nancy's father simply froze, unable to process what he was seeing. Then he leapt down the remaining stairs to his daughter's side and grabbed her hand, but it was freezing cold. He sprinted back up the stairs, and he dialed 911. Winnetka Police Sergeant Gene Calvados woke up to the sound of his wife's voice calling him from the other room. He blinked at his clock, which read 6:40 p.m. He'd worked overnight and hadn't gotten to bed until about midday, and now his wife was saying he had yet another phone call from headquarters. All Sergeant Calvados wanted was just to go back to sleep, but he forced himself to get up and go to the phone because this was his job. And as soon as he heard his lieutenant's voice in the phone, Calvados snapped wide awake. The lieutenant said there had been a double homicide, and Calvados needed to get to the scene right now. A few minutes later, Sergeant Calvados parked his car outside of Nancy and Richard's townhouse. Calvados had seen plenty of violent deaths in his life. Before he became a police officer, he had served in Vietnam, and he had watched other young men in his unit grow hardened to bloodshed and violence, but Calvados really never got used to it. In fact, Calvados could see the face of every dead person he'd ever seen as clearly as if they were still right in front of him. And now he braced himself for the faces he was about to see in that basement. Sergeant Calvados stepped out of his car, and he saw several officers speaking to Nancy's father outside the house. Calvados quickly introduced himself and then headed inside, where a forensics team was already combing through the townhouse. One of the forensics officers came over to Calvados. He said the double homicide had taken place in the basement, but before Calvados went downstairs, he wanted to show the detective 3 pieces of evidence they'd found on the first floor. The forensics officer pointed to the ground just a few feet away, and Calvados noticed Nancy's purse lying there with $500 in cash and several credit cards lying next to it. Calvados quickly noticed there was still a TV and a high-end stereo in the room, so it seemed unlikely that what they were dealing with here was a robbery gone bad. Then the forensics officer led Calvados towards a door that opened onto a small back patio. Calvados saw a perfectly cut square piece of glass, which had been removed from the door and placed on the floor inside. and the forensics officer pointed out something interesting. The door was still locked. So whoever cut the glass did not reach through the hole and unlock the door, which would have been easy. Instead, they literally climbed through the small hole in the door, which would have taken far more time and effort. Finally, the forensics officer took Calvados over to a small card table that was next to a moving box. The officer said it looked like someone had rifled through the box and put a single item from it on the table. Calvados leaned in, and a look of surprise came across his face. The item on the table was Nancy and Richard's marriage license. But the forensics officer said he didn't know yet if the person who broke in had put the license there or if maybe it just happened to be there already. Calvados thanked the officer, and then after taking a deep breath, he headed to the basement, hoping things would start to get a bit clearer down there. Calvados walked down the steps slowly, and as the scene came into view, he couldn't help but wince. Richard had been handcuffed and shot in the back of the head. It looked like he had probably died instantly. Nancy, though, was not handcuffed, and her death had clearly been slow. She was shot twice in her side and in her abdomen, and there was blood smeared all around her body, like she had crawled or rolled in the blood after being wounded, and her eyes were still open, frozen in her final moment. Calvados also saw an axe on the floor between Richard and Nancy, and he wondered how that figured into the crime if the killer had a gun. Had the couple tried to fight back with it? He didn't know. Then something else caught Sergeant Calvados' attention. On a moving box between the bodies, a small heart and the letter U were scrawled in blood. Calvados crouched down and saw blood on one of Nancy's fingertips, so he wondered if she had left this message or if the killer had staged it to look that way. Regardless of the answer, Calvados realized whoever killed Nancy and Richard had not acted in the heat of the moment. The handcuffs and the execution-style shooting of Richard proved that. And that execution-style shooting made Calvados wonder if the murders had been carried out by a professional hitman. The cut glass in the patio door could also support that theory because it suggested a very high level of planning. But Calvados stood there and just shook his head, like he was arguing with himself. Removing the glass in the door seemed like something a professional would do, but then why would the professional killer squeeze through the small hole in the door instead of just reaching in and unlocking the door? Also, Richard's murder seemed like a cold-blooded, very efficient assassination, whereas Nancy's murder seemed sloppy. She clearly lived long enough to roll or crawl through the blood on the floor, and she might have lived long enough to even write that message on the moving box. So in a way, Calvados felt like he was almost looking at two different crime scenes at once. One crime scene for Richard and one crime scene for Nancy. Calvados suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. It was one of the officers who'd been talking to Nancy's dad. The officer told Calvados he had very important information. Nancy had been pregnant. Calvados' heart sank. He knew the look on Nancy's face would stay with him for a very long time. Later that day, as officers met with Nancy and Richard's neighbors, the chief of police decided to form a task force to investigate the double murder. He said he would ask for help from detectives from surrounding suburbs, but he wanted Sergeant Calvados to lead the team. Calvados knew this was going to be the biggest challenge of his career. A double homicide of a young couple that was potentially carried out by a professional hitman was a whole different level of crime than he'd ever seen in Winnetka. The next day, Sergeant Calvados knocked on the door of Nancy's parents' house. Nancy's dad opened the door, and Calvados could tell from his puffy eyes that he'd been crying. As gently as he could, Calvados asked the father if he could get Nancy and Richard's wedding albums and address books, or anything that could help him identify all of their friends and acquaintances. Nancy's father just nodded, looking shell-shocked, and invited the sergeant to come inside while he looked. Calvados stepped inside and then sat down on the couch, and Nancy's mother came in. She also had a vacant stare on her face, almost like she literally couldn't process what had happened. Still, almost on autopilot, she politely offered him some coffee, which Calvados said no thank you to. Then, Calvados told her that he was the one leading this investigation, and he really needed her to think as hard as she could about all the people in her daughter's life. Did she know anyone who might want to hurt Nancy or Richard? But Nancy's mother shook her head and said no. And as Nancy's father came in with the things the sergeant had asked for, he also said the same thing. Nancy and Richard were wonderful people with a big supportive group of friends. The idea that either of them had enemies seemed kind of ridiculous. On Tuesday, April 10th, so 3 days after the murders, Nancy and Richard's bosses at the coffee company offered a $10,000 reward for information in the case, and also Nancy's parents matched it. And so tips about Nancy and Richard began to pour in. Phones at police headquarters rang constantly, and before long, the task force was totally inundated. And as Sergeant Calvados sifted through all this new information they were getting, a new and much more complicated picture of the murdered couple began to emerge. A few tipsters alerted the sergeant to Richard's gambling debts and the fact that he very likely owed people money because of his gambling problem. This was a major red flag to Calvados, but the debts themselves actually seemed way too small to be worth killing two people over. However, the tips about Nancy were more promising. Apparently, she had had an affair for more than a year, and her former lover had left town for Georgia just 2 days after the murders. This, combined with the marriage contract left on the table at the crime scene, made Calvados wonder if the killings were retaliation from Nancy's ex-lover for breaking the affair off. Calvados sent detectives down to Georgia to speak with Nancy's former lover, but the man said the affair was far more emotional than physical. Nancy mostly just wanted someone to talk to because Richard was working 2 jobs and she was just kind of lonely. But when Richard got his full-time job at the coffee company, the couple had totally reconciled and they got back to normal. And so this ex-lover said at that point, he also had been ready to move on. And so even though the move to Georgia came so close to the murders, it had actually been planned out for weeks. Calvados wasn't quite prepared to rule this man out quite yet, but he was already finding this case very frustrating. Everything from the conflicting evidence at the crime scene where, one murder is well planned and the other seems sloppy, and, the glass, why did you climb through and not unlock it by reaching through, to the contradictory stories about the victims seemed to pull him in very different directions. Meanwhile, rumors of hitmen and criminal syndicates began flying all over town. There was a bike path that ran behind Nancy and Richard's house, leading basically all the way to Chicago, and residents became convinced that a Chicago mobster must have been the killer, and they must have used that path to travel in and out sight unseen. Calvados did not necessarily buy that, but he got a tip that a close friend of Nancy's father, a man named Victor, supposedly had ties to the mafia. So Calvados began digging. However, he struggled to find anything useful. At least on the surface, Victor looked like an upstanding businessman. So Calvados was not any closer to nailing down a primary suspect. Four days after the murders, a massive crowd of 800 people from the area gathered for Nancy and Richard's funeral. The community really came out in force, to the point where random local groups like the high school's Peace Alliance Club and the track team were waiting in these long lines after the service just to offer their condolences to Nancy and Richard's family. Their deaths really took a toll on this town. Sergeant Calvados and some other detectives also went to the funeral, but mostly just to look for anybody who seemed nervous or excited or maybe overly dramatic. But all they found was a large group of people trying desperately to understand how something this horrible could have happened. After the funeral, Calvados went back to the station. He was on his way to his office when a lieutenant stopped him to tell him that somebody was there to see him. The lieutenant took Calvados to a very nervous-looking couple who said they had a tip about Nancy's sister, Jean. Jean was a lawyer, and she was heavily involved in political issues in Ireland. At that time, Ireland was in the midst of a violent period known as the Troubles. The Troubles were clashes between Protestants and Catholics over control of Northern Ireland, and there were regular shootings, car bombings, murders, and kidnappings. And Jean was not neutral. She provided legal aid to members of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, which was the Catholic organization blamed for many acts of violence. The couple also told Sergeant Calvados that Jean had received a threat that if she returned to Ireland, she would be injured or maybe even killed. But despite that threat, Jean had gone back to Ireland very recently, and when she had arrived home, she showed up with gifts for Nancy and the baby just 3 days before the murders. The sergeant listened quietly, but inside, he was practically jumping out of his skin. This was the best lead he'd gotten so far. Maybe, he thought, somebody was hired to kill Jean, but killed Nancy and her husband by mistake. Or maybe they killed Nancy on purpose just to hurt Jean. It was not unheard of during the Troubles for innocent family members to be targeted for political revenge. And so, after speaking to this couple, Calvados got on the phone and called Jean into the station. Later that day, Calvados sat down across a table in a small interview room with Jean, and he could tell right away she was completely unlike any suspect he'd ever questioned before. Jean was unusually confident for somebody who was about to be questioned by a homicide detective. She sat up perfectly straight and calmly looked Calvados right in the eyes, without fidgeting or tapping her fingers or shifting around in her seat. Calvados asked Jean some basic questions about her job, and she was quite helpful. But then, the sergeant mentioned the threat that had been made on her life because of her work in Ireland, and also this theory that maybe a hired killer took out Nancy either by mistake or for revenge. At this point, Jean's demeanor totally changed. She went from cool and collected to sharp and visibly angry. She said it was ridiculous to imagine a gunman could confuse Nancy for her. They looked nothing alike. And the idea that someone would kill Nancy to get back at Jean was even more outrageous. Jean insisted that her job in Ireland was mostly human rights work and not worth killing her over, let alone her sister. Jean leaned forward and looked Calvados dead in the eyes and told him he was really stretching with that theory. Calvados was genuinely surprised. This was not what he was expecting, and he wasn't sure if Jean's reaction was fueled by righteous indignation at questions she truly considered unfair, or anxiety and guilt at the idea that she might have played a role in putting her sister at risk. But the sergeant pressed on, and he asked Jean for the names of every person she had visited the last time she was in Ireland, along with all of her work associates there. Jean turned red and yelled at the sergeant that none of this had anything to do with her sister's murder. She said Calvados was not getting anything from her, and then she stood up and stormed out of the interview room. Sergeant Calvados just sat there, both really surprised and really mad. This death threat on Jean was the first real lead they had, and he couldn't fully investigate it without the names from Jean. He had expected her to be grateful and to immediately offer up anything she knew to try to figure out who killed her sister. And so he just couldn't believe Jean was unwilling to help him, unless, of course, she was involved. Without any information from Jean about the death threat, Calvados was left chasing other possibilities that frankly just seemed increasingly unlikely. Both Richard and Nancy had worked for a coffee company that imported their beans from Colombia, which Calvados and basically everybody knew was a major importer of cocaine. He knew that drug cartels sometimes hid cocaine in coffee shipments. In fact, just 3 months before the murders, federal agents had seized 5 kilograms of cocaine in a coffee shipment from a different coffee company. So Calvados started poking around into the coffee company, looking for any ties to cartels. But the owners of the company seemed mostly puzzled by this, and they gave Calvados permission to inspect their next shipment. Like, they didn't care at all. Look at whatever you want. And so Calvados did that, flagging the ship that had their coffee on it to U.S. Customs officers, who then met the vessel when it came into port. A giant crane lifted the container with their coffee out of the ship and onto the dock, and then Customs officer cracked it open. Then they began slicing through random bags of beans to see if their drug-sniffing German shepherds could pick up a scent. But, like Calvados had feared, they found nothing. The police began to feel like they were just grasping at straws, and so they decided they should just go back to the beginning and kind of start over. So they re-interviewed all the neighbors, and they got one tantalizing tip about a mysterious man walking around the neighborhood the night of the murders, but after looking into it, they discovered it was actually just a bored teenager who lived nearby. After that, they looked into whether Richard and Nancy had maybe taken a loan from mobsters to lease their new place, but when they looked at the couple's tax records, they saw they could easily afford the rent. And so, once again, one after another, all the tips and leads they were finding just went nowhere. Calvados still had suspicions that Jean's ties to the IRA got her sister killed, but without Jean's cooperation, he struggled to make any headway on that lead. So, by the end of May, Sergeant Calvados was basically out of ideas as his big case rapidly went cold. Finally, on May 30th, so about a month after the murders, the police chief pulled Calvados into his office. From the look on Chief's face, Calvados knew the news was not good, but he could not have guessed what was coming next. The chief told him they were going to dismantle the task force. They had spent a whopping $1 million on this investigation so far and still had not come up with a serious single suspect. Calvados was shocked. This felt way too early to basically give up. But the chief wasn't done. In addition to dismantling the task force, he wanted Calvados back on the beat while another investigator stepped in and took a look at this case. The chief followed up and told Calvados that he was not taking him off the case completely, he just wanted a set of fresh eyes on it. But as Calvados nodded and turned to walk out of the office, it definitely felt like he had failed and he was being removed. Sergeant Calvados walked slowly towards his team to break the bad news, at the same time feeling totally sick and angry at the thought of patrolling the neighborhood again with everything in this case still completely up in the air. But a few days later, sure enough, Calvados was back in his blue uniform, driving a police cruiser around Winnetka. He figured his days as a detective were likely over. 6 months passed with no progress at all in the Langert case. Sergeant Calvados focused on working his beat, but at the same time, he just felt so distracted because all he felt was regret that he had not been able to find the killer. But then, on October 4th, Sergeant Calvados was home sleeping when his wife woke him up telling him that work was calling, just like she had done on the day of the murder. But this time, when he picked the phone up, his lieutenant was yelling excitedly that there had been a break in Nancy and Richard's case, and Calvados had to get down to the station right now. Calvados was so excited, he rushed out of bed, he jumped into his car, and he sped to the station, but when he got there, he found the supposed break was just a kid, and not a very tough-looking kid either. It was a skinny high school senior who had arrived at the station with his girlfriend for moral support, asking about the witness protection program. Calvados had to keep himself from rolling his eyes. He wondered what this kid could possibly know about a brutal double homicide. And at first, when the kid began talking, his story, predictably, sounded unbelievable. The kid said he somehow knew the killer, and the killer had supposedly confessed everything to him in unbelievable detail. But as he began walking Calvados and the other detectives through what he knew, Calvados realized this kid was telling the truth. The teenager knew details of the crime that had never been made public, like how many shots were fired and the fact that the marriage contract was on the table. But beyond individual details, the teenager's story explained all the strange contradictions that Calvados had struggled with since the beginning of the case. Richard was killed quickly and efficiently, but Nancy's murder was messy and slow. The killer had apparently brought a gun along, but someone had grabbed an axe that wasn't entirely clear, and then the killer had used glass-cutting tools to get inside, but then needlessly crawled through the tiny hole in the door instead of just reaching through and unlocking it. And so all these things definitely lined up with what Calvados had suspected. Calvados had never been able to figure out if the killer was a professional hitman or a sloppy amateur, but now, as the sergeant listened to this kid talk, it seemed like the killer might have been a little bit of both. After speaking to this kid and looking at all the evidence in the case and looking at all their interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police think happened on the night of Saturday, April 7th, 1990, when Nancy and Richard were murdered inside of their home. The killer arrived at Nancy and Richard's townhouse while the couple was out to dinner. The killer had been preparing for this moment for months. They approached the patio door from the path that ran behind the house. They didn't even bother trying the doorknob. Instead, they pulled out a glass cutter to remove a section of the sliding patio doors. And then once the cuts were made, they stuck some very sticky tape to the front of the glass piece and then pulled it out silently, just like they had been practicing. Then, once it was out, instead of reaching through and opening the door, the killer crawled into the house through the hole and then waited. But they had no idea how long it would be before Nancy and Richard came home, and as the minutes turned to hours, the killer began to get restless. And so they just started wandering around the house sort of aimlessly, rifling through random boxes that were sitting around. And it was there that the killer found Nancy and Richard's marriage contract. They began to read it, but it was mostly legal jargon, so they just placed it on the card table near the box they dug it out of. But the longer the killer waited for Nancy and Richard to come home, the more impatient they got, and the more nervous. And so they ultimately just turned on a light and then sat on a chair in the shadows with their gun on their lap. They had a hood pulled down low, but they thought the light shining from behind them would help hide their face even more. Then finally, sometime after 11 p.m., the killer heard voices and then the key in the door. Nancy and Richard walked inside, but they were so caught up in their conversation, they didn't even notice the killer sitting there. But then the killer spoke and told them to be quiet and closed the door behind them. The killer could instantly see how startled Nancy and Richard were. The killer then raised their gun, and Nancy and Richard's surprise quickly turned to fear. The killer loved it. The killer demanded Nancy hand over her purse. She said she didn't have any money, but the killer demanded the purse again, and so Nancy threw it to the killer, and everything inside of it fell out onto the floor, including the stack of cash totaling $500. Nancy started stammering that she'd forgotten about the money, and Richard urged the killer to just please take the cash and go. She wasn't trying to lie to you. But the killer, who acted totally offended at the idea that they were hiding things from him, was not actually here for their money. They didn't care. The killer, still aiming their gun at Nancy and Richard, reached into their pocket to pull out handcuffs. But as they fished around in their pocket, they began to curse. In their excitement about this night, they'd only brought one pair of handcuffs, not the two they actually needed. But Richard was clearly the bigger threat. He was a tall, athletic guy, So the killer gave the cuffs to Nancy and told her to handcuff her husband. As Nancy handcuffed Richard's hands behind his back, she began to plead with the killer. "Please don't hurt us. I'm pregnant." Something about Nancy's plea hit the killer hard, and they could feel their hands begin to shake. Suddenly there was a noise upstairs, and the killer accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting a bullet into the baseboards. But the killer quickly realized that the noise was just the dog, closed in the upstairs bedroom, barking at something. Still, the killer felt like their plan was now quickly falling apart. Things were already going so wrong. The killer started to lose their nerve, and they thought about sparing Nancy and Richard. So the killer told the couple to go to the basement, and then once they were down there, the killer would lock the door and just leave. And so the killer directed Nancy and Richard to the basement stairs at gunpoint, and no one said a word. But as Nancy and Richard descended the stairs and then reached the bottom of the stairs, Nancy suddenly turned around and looked at the killer. And the killer knew from her surprised look on her face that she had seen the killer's face. The light was better down there, and the hood did not disguise the killer enough. The killer knew Nancy would be able to identify them. And so now the killer had a choice to make. Let them live and face the consequences, or follow through with the plan. But before the killer could decide, Richard made a desperate move. With all his strength, he snapped the cheap handcuffs, jumped at the killer, and smashed his own head against the killer's head. Almost instinctively, the killer just fired the gun, and it hit Richard right in the back of his head. Richard crumpled to the floor. Nancy rushed to his side, screaming, then looked back at the killer, whose gun was still raised. Nancy shouted, "Not again, no!" and covered her face as the killer took a shot at her. The killer turned and ran up the stairs, but as they got to the top, they looked back. Nancy was still alive and moving. The bullet had only hit her in the elbow. The killer knew at this point they had already come this far, they had to go back. So the killer raised their gun again and pulled the trigger one more time. The bullet hit Nancy and lodged in her pregnant stomach. She collapsed to the floor, and the killer turned and ran out of the basement. But after the killer left, Nancy was still alive. Barely. She tried to climb up the stairs, but it was a struggle. The coat she was wearing was quickly filling with blood, weighing her down. And so with an enormous effort, she managed to pull off her jacket, but as she looked up the stairs, she knew it was just too much. She would never get up there. So, Nancy turned and dragged herself over to the basement shelves and grabbed the nearest thing she could reach, the axe. And then with the axe, she banged on the shelf, hoping that the noise would get somebody's attention, but nobody came to the rescue. And so with her last bit of strength, Nancy dropped the axe, dipped her finger in her own blood, dragged herself over to a moving box on the floor, and drew a heart and the letter U. She looked at Richard, hoping maybe there was a small chance he would live and see her final message. "I love you." And then Nancy took her final breath. When the police began investigating this case, they knew that some of the evidence suggested the killer was an amateur, but most of their leads pointed to a professional hitman, which is why Calvados and his team had been so interested in the mob and in drugs and the IRA. It was a mistake that allowed one person to escape any attention at all, because the killer was right there, hanging around the investigation in plain sight the entire time. He was one of the members of the High School Peace Alliance Club who came to the funeral. He was on the track team too, so he ran past the Langerts' house almost every single day. The police had even questioned him, because he was also the teenage boy who had been seen in the neighborhood on the night of the murders, but had quickly been written off. But it turned out that kid, the 16-year-old named David Biro, was the killer. And he also happened to be the son of Nancy's family friends, Nick and Joan Biro, who Nancy had thought might be at her father's birthday party on the night that she was killed. It would turn out 16-year-old David had serious psychological issues, and he had become obsessed with becoming a hitman after seeing the 1980s movie, Bestseller, about a hitman who wanted to turn his story into a book. The idea of killing people excited David, and he had actually already tried to do it at least once before. Prior to the murders, David's parents had him committed to a psychiatric hospital after he tried to poison his own family. But after only 2 months, his parents had let him come home against the recommendation of his doctors. And once he was home, teenager David Biro chose to live out his hitman fantasy by killing Nancy and Richard. And his reason for targeting Nancy and Richard had nothing to do with their connections to his family. Instead, he chose them as his murder victims because their townhouse was conveniently located, and he also found them, quote, annoying. David might have gotten away with these murders, but as the months went by and the police never came for him, he got cocky, and he began to brag to a friend about what he had done. He even showed his friend the glass that he'd practiced his glass cutting on, and he also showed him the murder weapon. And David's friend pretty much immediately turned him in, because he was very worried David would kill again. And so, on October 5th, 1990, almost 6 months to the day after Nancy and Richard were gunned down, David was arrested. It was the day before Nancy's baby would have been due. David was sentenced to life in prison for killing Nancy, Richard, and their unborn child. Nancy's parents would move back into Nancy and Richard's townhouse shortly after the murders as a way to feel closer to Nancy and Richard. At around 9 p.m. on Saturday, October 15th, 1988, a 33-year-old woman named Cheryl Petrie grabbed a candy bar off the rack inside of PJ's Market. PJ's Market was a little convenience store in the city of Port Orchard, Washington, and it was where Cheryl worked. She was the cashier. And without ringing this candy bar up, Cheryl simply handed it across the counter to a female college student who had just come into the store to talk to Cheryl. This student had temporarily moved right next door to PJ's Market, and the student, after coming into the market and meeting Cheryl, they had immediately taken a liking to her, and so it became kind of like her routine to come into the market basically every night and just sit down and chat with Cheryl, sometimes for hours. The student would talk about their day at school, they'd talk about their personal life, they'd tell Cheryl all of their problems and secrets. I mean, Cheryl really became this student's confidant. And believe it or not, this was an effect that Cheryl had on lots of people. Cheryl was incredibly kind, she was empathetic, she was a great listener, she never acted like she was judging you, and she never gossiped about people. And also Cheryl had a very disarming sense of humor. It was very goofy, she was always cracking up at jokes that she had made, and so people just felt at ease around Cheryl. And they typically left interactions with her in a good mood. And on this night, when the student had come into the market, they had told Cheryl that they actually had found an apartment in Port Orchard that they were going to be moving to, so they were going to be leaving PJ's where they were now. But the student had said that they really had no money, and so it was going to be a challenge to furnish this apartment. Heck, it was going to be a challenge just to buy groceries for this apartment. And when Cheryl heard this, she first congratulated the student, but then also said, well, hey, I'll give you some of my own furniture because I don't need it all, and that will help you furnish the apartment. And then also Cheryl had grabbed that chocolate bar off the rack and given it to the student for free as a sort of like, here's your first grocery as well. The student was totally floored by Cheryl's generosity and tried to tell her, keep your furniture and you can keep this chocolate or I'll pay for it. But Cheryl insisted. She was like, nope, tomorrow I will bring you furniture and please take this candy bar. And so the student finally relented and thanked Cheryl profusely. And really, this behavior was so typical of Cheryl. She was a single mom raising a 9-year-old girl and a baby boy, and so she worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. On the weekends, she worked at PJ's Market, and then during the week, she worked at a Ford car dealership. But despite being totally swamped basically all the time providing for her family, any spare time Cheryl had, she tried to give it to other people. Whether that was helping a coworker with their resume or baking some goodies for a sick friend at church, Cheryl was all about helping other people. The area of Port Orchard where Cheryl lived was only about an hour away from the big city of Seattle, but to Cheryl, this part of Port Orchard felt much farther away than that. She lived in this tiny little blue single-story house that was tucked away in the woods, surrounded by all these tall trees. The road to her house was very rural and winding, and so where she lived felt very isolated. It was a beautiful area, no doubt, but it was also kind of a bad neighborhood. In fact, a man had been shot and killed not far from Cheryl's house just a year earlier. But this home was all she could afford. Basically, Cheryl was poor and had almost nothing of her own. But whatever she did have, she was far more likely to give away than keep for herself. Eventually, Cheryl would tell the college student that she really needed to get back to the other customers and kind of do her job and not just sit here and chat this whole time. And so the student said, thank you again for the candy and for the offer of the free furniture. And then the student left the store, at which point Cheryl reached into her pocket and grabbed some change and dumped it in the register to pay for the candy bar. Even though Cheryl knew she very likely could have gotten away with simply giving out the candy and not paying for it, Cheryl was unfailingly honest, and so she knew she wanted to pay for the candy. Cheryl would man the register until 11 p.m. that night, chatting with many more regulars who came in and out. And then at 11 p.m., Cheryl locked the front door, and then she checked the register to make sure it was all balanced and all the cash was in there. And then by 11:15, she was calling her boss to report that her shift had gone fine and that she was taking off for the night. After Cheryl had left and locked the store behind her, she made her way out to her beat-up silver sedan car that was parked outside, and then she began the drive back home, knowing that she'd be right back to PJ's the very next morning, right when it opened at 7 a.m. At the same time that Cheryl was wrapping up for the night and making her way home, her ex-husband, Roland Pitre, who lived on the other side of town, was very excited. This was the night that Roland was going to win back Cheryl. Roland glanced at his watch and saw it was just past 11 p.m., and so it was almost time. He imagined how happy Cheryl would be when he unveiled his big surprise. She would run to him and he would hold her and tell her how much he loved her and how he had always loved her. Roland hadn't yet figured out how he was going to explain his big plan to win back his ex to his current girlfriend, but he figured he would just work that out later. The most important thing for Roland right now was showing Cheryl how wrong and stupid he had been and how much he needed her and how much she needed him. Also, he knew their kids would be totally thrilled if they got back together. Roland was looking after their son and daughter that weekend, and he had seen firsthand that his daughter was clearly very upset about the fact that her parents were split up. Roland and Cheryl had a very complicated history, but Roland knew, really, their breakup was his fault. They had met about 12 years earlier when Roland had been on leave from the military. At the time, Roland was a Marine sergeant, and he was also a very accomplished judo instructor. He was handsome and charismatic, and he had a charming Creole accent because he had grown up in a Cajun French family near New Orleans. But despite how appealing Roland looked, he actually was kind of a terrible romantic partner. Every woman he had ever been with, he had cheated on and then made up elaborate lies to cover it up. But regardless, Cheryl had fallen head over heels in love with Roland. And part of the reason that happened was because Cheryl was actually pretty insecure. She had long auburn hair and beautiful blue eyes and this amazing personality. But to Cheryl, she felt like she was kind of plain looking, and she also felt like she was kind of chubby, and she got the sense that men kind of did not find her all that attractive. And when she met Roland, she saw right away that the other women he had been with were these overtly glamorous and beautiful women. And so when she noticed Roland taking an interest in her, I mean, it was incredible. She felt so lucky. And so Roland and Cheryl had gotten married, they'd had their daughter together, and then basically right away, Roland had begun cheating on Cheryl. They ended up getting divorced 8 years earlier in 1980, and it was right around this point that Roland really just totally blew his life up. The woman Roland was cheating on Cheryl with was also married, and so Roland came up with this plot to murder this woman's husband. And the husband would get murdered, but when Roland was on trial, the prosecutors couldn't really untangle what his actual role was in the murder. It was not clear if he really was the guy who did the killing, or if he simply had kind of come up with the idea and other people had done it. And so ultimately, Roland was found guilty for his role in this murder, but he was only sentenced to 6 years in prison. And strangely enough, it was actually during this time that Roland was in jail that he and Cheryl kind of came back to each other. While Roland was behind bars, he had this epiphany that Cheryl was the best thing that ever happened to him, and he totally screwed it up. And so he began writing her letters, telling her how much he loved her and how sorry he was for being unfaithful. And also he began explaining that, the charges he was found guilty of in connection to this murder were totally not true, that he had been screwed. And Cheryl had eventually begun writing back to Roland, telling him that she still loved him too. And they actually would get remarried while Roland was in prison. And then when he got out of prison, he moved in with Cheryl and their daughter in Port Orchard, and they would have another baby together, their son, and then also Roland enrolled in nursing school. And so for a time, this family was back together and everything was great. But eventually, Roland went back to his old ways and began cheating on Cheryl again, and before long, the couple had separated again and began living separately. And so fast forward back to the night of October 15th, 1988, and Roland is anxiously waiting to begin this big plan to win Cheryl back, and he glances at his watch and he sees it's now 11:30 p.m., which means it's go time. And so Roland, he stands up really quickly and begins walking towards the front door of his house when suddenly he feels so lightheaded that he actually falls back on the couch and passes out cold. Roland had serious blood pressure issues, and sometimes if he stood up too quickly, it would make him feel really dizzy and he would faint, and so that's what happened. And then at some point after he fainted, Roland kind of came to, but he was in such a fog mentally that instead of, going out and doing this big plan to win Cheryl back, he just kind of wandered his way upstairs and climbed in bed with his girlfriend and fell asleep for the rest of the night. Cheryl was due back at PJ's Market the next morning at 7 a.m. She was going to open the store and also drop off that furniture with the college student. But when the first customers, including that college student, arrived at PJ's Market, they saw the door was locked and the lights were off inside. Now, all of these customers knew Cheryl really well and they really liked her, and they knew she should have been there by that point. This was totally uncharacteristic of Cheryl to not be there on time, and so it wasn't long before these patrons began calling Cheryl at her home. But Cheryl never picked up. However, remember, this is 1988, so people didn't have cell phones, they used landlines, and so it was totally normal to periodically call someone and not have them pick up. It just meant they weren't home. Now, at first, people in Port Orchard just kind of assumed that, there must be a rational explanation for why Cheryl is not at work. Maybe there was a family emergency, maybe her car didn't start, but there had to be some sort of reasonable reason for her absence. But that night, Cheryl didn't show up at Roland and his girlfriend's house to collect her daughter and son. Now, Roland didn't know that Cheryl had missed work all day that day, and so he assumed Cheryl must just be running late. But by 6:30 p.m. that night, when still Cheryl had not arrived and she hadn't called, Roland finally called Cheryl. But she didn't answer, and so Roland just left Cheryl this very upbeat message on her answering machine and then waited for her to call back. But despite how cheerful this message was that Roland left, it kind of betrayed the way he actually felt. Roland was not happy. That morning, when he had woken up and realized he had slept through the night and not done the big plan to win Cheryl back, he felt so stupid. He had this chance to win her back, and he blew it. But over the next couple of hours, when Cheryl did not return Roland's call, he went from being solely worried about, how he blew this opportunity to win his ex-wife back, to now just being concerned about his ex-wife. Where is she? What's going on? And so late that night, Roland would actually call the police and report Cheryl missing. A deputy came out to Roland's house to take down this report, and then Roland actually gave the deputy a spare key to Cheryl's place, and then this deputy went to Cheryl's house. It was totally quiet. He knocked, there was no answer. He let himself inside using this spare key, and he found the home was totally in order. There was no sign of any disturbance whatsoever. The deputy eventually walked over to Cheryl's answering machine, and he saw there was a blinking light, which meant there were messages that had not been played yet. And so he hit play, and the first message was from Cheryl's daughter, who was calling to say goodnight and I love you. And then there were several messages from customers from PJ's Market that were calling to ask, why Cheryl was not at work and was she okay. There was a message from Cheryl's boss also asking, what's going on? Why aren't you at work? And then there was that message from Roland, who had called when she had not come to pick up the kids. And then the last message on the machine played, and when the deputy heard it, he knew something was terribly wrong. The last message was from a stranger who was calling Cheryl to be like, hey, I found your purse floating in Lake Union, which is near Seattle. And the stranger was like, I don't know if your purse was stolen and dumped here, or if you were here and you left it in the water or something, but I'd love to give the purse back to you. And the stranger left a phone number for Cheryl to call so she could come and pick up her purse. Lake Union was only about an hour away from Port Orchard, where Cheryl lived, but there was just no real reason she would ever be around Lake Union. She never went on trips. She didn't have the time or money to, even for short ones, like going to Lake Union an hour away. And then also, Cheryl's entire life was in Port Orchard, and her life was her kids, her jobs, and the church. And so there was just no logical explanation for why Cheryl's purse would be in Lake Union. But regardless, detectives from Port Orchard, along with police from Seattle, linked up and went out to Lake Union and began looking for Cheryl's car, because maybe she did go out here, maybe she did lose her purse in the water, and maybe she's still here. But Lake Union is a very busy place with lots of people and businesses living right along the water's edge, and even more people living right on the water in houseboats. And so there were literally thousands and thousands of cars all over Lake Union, so trying to find Cheryl's nondescript silver sedan took some time. But on the night of October 19th, so 3 days after Cheryl had failed to show up at PJ's Market for that 7 a.m. opening, police would find her car near Lake Union. And at first, it seemed like, Cheryl must have just driven here and abandoned the car for some reason, because there was no sign of a struggle inside or outside of the car. There was nothing strange about this car. It was just parked in a lot. But when authorities went around to the back of the car and used a screwdriver to pop open the trunk, they realized right away that that could not have been what happened, because Cheryl was in the trunk, and she was deceased and very clearly had been beaten to death. The investigation into Cheryl's murder would take more than a decade. The police started with Roland because 1, he was Cheryl's ex-husband, and 2, because Roland had previously been convicted for his role in a murder, even though the details of exactly what he did were never really clear. But Roland had an alibi that was airtight. He had witnesses that could confirm he was nowhere near Lake Union or Cheryl on the night that she was killed. And Roland was very cooperative with police after finding out what happened to his ex-wife. He was really bent out of shape. And so Roland very quickly signed paperwork to allow detectives to come into his home and search it and search all of his things. And he also began regularly contacting the police to offer up any information he could think of that could be useful, including an odd story he told about this young man that was following Cheryl around in the few days before she died. He didn't know much about it, but he knew there was something odd happening with this young man. Now, Roland didn't really have much more information than this suggestion that somebody was following her around, and so police were never really able to fully follow up on that lead. But police did interview virtually everybody in Cheryl's life, from her friends to her family to her coworkers at the Ford dealership and PJ's Market. They talked to people at church who knew her, and nobody really popped up as being very suspicious. Basically, everyone said, look, Cheryl was this incredible person who everybody seemed to love. It makes no sense that somebody would want to harm her. But a year after Cheryl's death, the police would get their first big break in this case. A newspaper journalist contacted the police to let them know that this random young man had contacted him and confessed to killing Cheryl and then hung up without giving his name or his location or how to get in touch with him again. It was almost like this person had called just to get this huge secret off their chest somewhat anonymously. The police convinced the journalist to actually write a story about this strange call he got to see if maybe they could flush out this young man who had just confessed. And when this article ran in the newspaper, one of Cheryl's old coworkers from the car dealership called the police to be like, hey, there was this young man who worked at this dealership with us and with Cheryl who was totally creepy and definitely had a thing for Cheryl. The coworker said this guy's name was Albie Brotsweller and that he worked in the garage and he was known as a kind of odd guy with a short temper who totally creeped out all the women who worked at the dealership. And this coworker would tell police that before Cheryl died, she had been working with Albie on his resume. And while they had been working together, Albie had developed this weird fixation on Cheryl. And when police began looking into Albie, they discovered he had quit his job at the dealership a day before Cheryl went missing, and then a couple of days after he had quit, so by this point Cheryl has been found murdered, one of Cheryl's colleagues said they saw Albie, and he had this really deep cut on his hand that he kept wrapped in a big bandage. Detectives would also discover that Albee's father lived right near PJ's Market, and Albee's mother lived right near the area where Cheryl's car had been found out near Lake Union. And so suddenly, Roland's previously odd-seeming story about some random young man following Cheryl around before she was murdered made a lot of sense. It seemed like Albee was this strange young man Roland was talking about. When detectives tracked Albee down, he was sullen and totally uncooperative. But eventually, the police got him to talk, and he would tell them that he had cut his hand fishing. And so police rounded up all these people Albee said he had been fishing with when he cut his hand, and in separate interviews, all of those people confirmed that Albee was telling the truth. And also police knew that even though circumstantially Albee looked really suspicious, there was not a single shred of actual evidence that tied him to Cheryl's death. And so pretty quickly, Albee was let go, and the police at that point kind of hit a dead end in this case. And in fact, the case went totally cold at this point. And then, one day in 2002, so 14 years after Cheryl was murdered, a man in prison got word out to police that he actually knew exactly who killed Cheryl. He said the murderer's name was Frederick J. McKee, and that he was currently incarcerated for cooking meth. Now, we don't know exactly how this inmate knew Frederick was the killer, but this inmate who called police was cellmates with Frederick McKee, and so very likely he overheard Frederick say something incriminating, and so this inmate called the police. And so police got a DNA sample from McKee, and they compared his sample to the skin cells that were found on the duct tape that had been used to bind Cheryl's hands when she was killed, and unbelievably, it was a match. Frederick was the killer. But as police dug deeper, they quickly realized that, Frederick's heinous actions of actually killing Cheryl was not the worst part of the story. The story of what really happened to Cheryl Petre was so insanely nonsensical that right away, newspapers all over the country began to cover it. It was converted into a true crime documentary, and even a famous author wrote a book about it. I mean, this story really was just totally sensational. First, I'm going to give you the facts of what happened to Cheryl. And then I'm going to give you the absurd and tragic explanation for why these things happened to Cheryl. Late on the night of October 15th, 1988, so the night that Cheryl disappeared, the meth cook, Frederick J. McKee, ambushed Cheryl as she came home from PJ's Market. We don't know exactly where the ambush happened, but we think it happened right outside of Cheryl's home. And after he ambushed her, he forced her into her own trunk, he bound her hands, and then began savagely beating her. Now, based on her injuries, Cheryl obviously put up a big fight, kicking and punching and trying her best to get out of the trunk, but eventually Frederick had taken the actual metal of the trunk and began slamming it down on Cheryl's face, and that allowed him to overpower her and eventually beat her to death. And then after she was dead, he shut the trunk with Cheryl inside of her car, and then he drove her car all the way out to Lake Union, and then he abandoned the car with Cheryl still inside of it and chucked her purse into the water. But this terrible night was not supposed to go this way. Here's what was going on in the background. At the same time that Cheryl was closing up shop at PJ's Market and beginning her trip back home, her ex-husband, Roland, on the other side of town, was sitting in his house anxiously checking his watch, waiting for the right time to launch this big plan that was going to win Cheryl back. Roland's big plan was that he was going to save Cheryl's life. He had hired his buddy, Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, who he had met in prison, and he had given Frederick a spare key to Cheryl's house. McKee was instructed by Roland to sneak into Cheryl's place before 11 p.m., so before she came home from work, and then when she got home, McKee was supposed to jump out and ambush her and tie her up and abduct her. Roland had actually gone with McKee to a hardware store to purchase the rope and duct tape that McKee would use to tie Cheryl up. But when McKee actually got to the point in the plan where he was physically removing Cheryl from her home to go take her who knows where, that was when Roland was going to jump in and save the day. And Roland had really thought about how this moment was going to go. He was going to kick the front door in and jump inside and scream at McKee, "You can't do this!" and then attack him with his judo skills until McKee ran off scared, at which point Roland would cut Cheryl free and she would grab onto him and say, "Oh my goodness, you saved me, I love you, I need you." And then after this, Roland believed they would get back together and they would live happily ever after. However, on the night of October 15th, at 11:30, when Roland looked at his watch and saw it was time to go save his ex-wife, he stood up so quickly from the couch because he was so excited to go do this thing that he had one of his low blood pressure episodes and he fainted. And then when he came to a little while later, instead of going out the door to really at this point stopping this abduction from happening, Roland just kind of trudged upstairs and went to sleep. And this was a really big problem because Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, he was hired to actually abduct Cheryl. He was not aware that this was actually a setup for Roland to come in and save the day. McKee literally believed Roland wanted him to abduct his wife. And he didn't ask any questions. He just said, "Okay, I'll do that." And then when Roland didn't show up, Frederick went through with the actual abduction of Cheryl, and during this abduction, things got out of hand, and Frederick wound up beating Cheryl to death. Both Roland and McKee would be convicted for the murder of Cheryl Petrie. And by the time the cops had finally solved this cold case, Roland was actually already in prison for attempting to kidnap the son of another ex-wife in an effort to impress this ex-wife. It had not worked. Roland was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison, which was on top of the 25 years he was already serving, and McKee would get 20 years. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.